Um, Earlier in the week, we said that Tories' miserly pay offer to nurses gave Labour an opportunity to regain their confidence in challenging Tory injustice. Initial signs were good. Keir Starmer led with the issues of nurses' pay and landed some real blows on Boris Johnson at this week's PMQs for only recommending a 1% pay rise for nurses, which, given inflation, would be an effective pay cut. The party strategy has hit a bit of a bump in the road, though. This is over questions of quite how much nurses' pay should be raised by. Now, the Royal College of Nurses, they are the Royal College of Nursing, they are the union which represents nurses, are proposing a 12.5% increase in pay. Labour aren't going that far. Now, they have suggested that nurses deserve at least a 2.1% pay rise. Now, that's the figure the government had originally budgeted for nurses' pay before the pandemic. They obviously changed their minds when they said, oh, the money's tight now, sorry, nurses will have to pay for the crisis. In terms of the precise pay rise which Labour are proposing, the deputy leader, Angela Rayner, was pushed on the party's position on BBC Breakfast.
You're saying you are the party that's behind the NHS. And we know what the government said. They've said 1%. And you know the Royal College of Nursing has said 12%. So why wouldn't you, as the Labour Party, support the Royal College of Nursing's demands for 12%?
Well, there's a pay review body and a number of trade unions
that you think,
and a number of trade unions that are involved in that. And I think that negotiation should start. But actually, the starting point, at the very least, should be what the government had legislated and budgeted for. Because we all know that the NHS staff have put themselves at risk during this pandemic. We know we've got thousands of vacancies already across our NHS. If we give them a real terms pay cut now, we're going to have serious problems in filling those vacancies and dealing with the backlog of cancer patients that we've got and supporting our key workers that have supported us through one of the most difficult times this country has ever faced.
And the government have broken
their promise, and they should at least give 2.1%.
Okay, so you're using the word at least. If I look back to the Labour Party manifesto of 2019, at that point, and this is prior to the pandemic, of course, when everyone's even more grateful and full of praise for what the NHS has done, the Labour Party manifesto 2019, you were saying they should get 5%. So, I mean, have you come down from that marker? And if you could say a number then, why can't you say a number now?
Well, you know, we're talking about our election launch for May now, and, you know, what we've got to remind ourselves, in that manifesto in 2019, the general public completely rejected it. You know, it was one of our worst election defeats. So what me and Keir have done when we took over the leadership of the Labour Party is listen to voters. And if you listen to voters now, 12 months on from the start of this pandemic, they would say that the government should at least honour its promise to our NHS workers.
Okay, sorry, I'm trying not to talk. I'm trying very deliberately not to talk about the government.
I'm trying to say that our NHS staff deserve a pay rise.
Now, it's not a particularly good media outing when you've gone on to attack the government where they're on the ropes. You know, the government really unpopular for not offering nurses a pay rise here. You end up spending most of the discussion attacking yourself from a year ago. You know, Angela Rayner stood on that manifesto, as did Keir Starmer. So they've gone on there attacking the Tories, and they end up saying, actually, the real problem was the Labour Party, who voters rejected because it was such a bad offer we promised. The substantial, I suppose, takeaway from that interview is that Labour do want nurses to have a pay rise, just not a particularly substantial one. It's a very Keir Starmer position, a bit more generous than the Tories, much less so than the unions. The problem this could pose for Sir Keir is that Boris Johnson is quite a flexible prime minister, and it appears he might have spotted an opportunity to outflank the Labour leader. The Times report that a government source has said it was a matter of when, not if, the current 1% offer is increased. The source said ministers were considering a rise of more than the 2.1% proposed by the NHS and suggested that a rise of between 2 and 3% would be realistic. There have been suggestions of 5%, although this is very unlikely. It's also understood it's not just Labour who are publicly speaking out against the prospect of only a 1% pay rise, which would be an effective pay cut. There are also Tory backbenchers unhappy about the position. Former Minister Caroline Noakes said on ITV's Peston this week, "It's a very bad look for the government. And as I say, I was stunned that it was as low as 1%. I think we will see it go upwards. It's just a question of how much." And I think it's really important that we reflect back on the Prime Minister's words last year when he was talking about the debt, the personal debt he owed those nurses who had looked after him. And so I'm really surprised that the government came out with this recommendation, and I'm very optimistic they won't stick to it. So it seems that a U-turn is likely, and fingers crossed it comes, because as always, but especially after this pandemic, NHS staff deserve it. But if that U-turn comes, what impact could it have on the Labour Party? Now, of course, if it happens, they'll claim it was a U-turn. They'll say they've had another victory in Parliament. But that argument won't stand up particularly well if the Tories don't just match the demand of Labour, which is 2.1% or thereabouts, but go above and beyond it. If I was a Tory Prime Minister, I would certainly be tempted to make that move. And I'd be tempted not least because it would undermine the core message Labour are putting forward to vote for them in May's election. That is, vote Labour to support nurses. It is a risky move to say our whole reason for being as a party at this upcoming election is to make sure nurses are properly paid, and then only commit to offering them a pay rise of 2.1% when they're asking for 12.5%. Dalia, this looks like another own goal for the Labour Party, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the strategy, right? Like, you don't actually have an ideological framework or a politics of your own. So every time something happens, you just look and you think, okay, the Tories are here, and then when it's the case of work, the unions are here. So whatever that their position is, we'll just go like 5 degrees closer than the Tories were. But that kind of robotic approach means that you miss these golden opportunities, not just from a moral perspective, but from a political one. You know, this is exposing the government for, a whole campaign could be done here about how, exposing the government for clapping for nurses and clapping for carers and then capping their pay, right? Like, it's a simple, it's popular amongst the public. It's in line, it should be in line with, the politics of any organization that calls itself a Labour Party. It would make the Labour Party more popular and the Tories less popular. And I don't know what stage of Starmer's 3-phase plan that actually becomes the strategy, because I have yet to see it. So, maybe like in response to that kind of robotic approach, unions should adapt the strategy of just going really, really, really hard on demands, so that sort of halfway point, although it's not even really halfway, is closer to what would actually be reasonable. But for me, the whole conversation about work actually in this pandemic has been really derailed, and that's really unfortunate. Because just before the pandemic, people who do sort of underpaid, like logistical, infrastructural, urban service work, delivery drivers, taxi drivers, couriers, care workers, nurses, supermarket workers, etc., were all called, low skilled, and they were sort of weaponized in a fight to increase border security. Then suddenly they became essential workers. We all realized that not only do we really, really need them, but they're having to put their lives on the line and undergo really risky work in order to keep our society going. And, the government felt, there was this sort of brief moment where we had this really good conversation about work, and, the government felt very embarrassed that they had called this workforce, the reliance upon whom has become very, very stark. They're embarrassed that they called them low skilled. But that hasn't really yet been translated into the idea of, okay, so we recognize that these workforces are doing essential work. So now what? What does that mean? And I think, to me, that means being treated with respect, not being worked to the bone, having more than enough money to take care of yourself and your dependents and live a good life and be comfortable, having humane working conditions. It means actual material consequences that aren't just, nice words and some claps on a Thursday evening. But I think that and, thanks to the Labour Party in part, that part of the conversation has conveniently been lost.
Very much so. I also want to talk about polling, because as Angela Rayner was saying in that interview, she was basically saying our position will be led by the public. They rejected our manifesto, which said a 5% pay rise, which means that we essentially have to go for less than 5%. Otherwise, we're not listening to the voters. Well, it turns out politics doesn't actually work like that. A poll from YouGov this week asked people whether they would back a 10% rise in nursing salaries, and 75% said yes. It wasn't 75% said, oh, they might need a tiny pay rise. 75%, 10%, yes, let's do it. What's important to recognize is this is across all voting groups. It's not one of those situations where they'll say, oh, it's only the core voters. If we offer 10% to the nurses, that will just pile up votes in the inner cities where we've already got seats. No, across the country, Tory voters, Labour voters, Lib Dem voters, everyone wants a big pay rise for nurses, and so they should. It's another own goal. Come on, just take a position, a strong position, and stick to it, and you will probably have a much better electoral result than constantly trying to second guess the electorate, which is what Keir Starmer is doing at present. People see through it.